Let's talk about what happened in the United States on Saturday with the biggest recorded protests in American history. Over 50 states, 2,700 protests, and 7 million people in total protested against Donald Trump. What exactly happened? Why did they protest? How did Donald Trump respond? And what's expected after these unprecedented protests in the United States? Well, firstly, these protests took place in 50 states again, and 2,700 locations. And we're not just talking about cities, we're talking about suburban areas, major metros, cities all across the country, not just one group of people. A wide array of diverse backgrounds came to these protests. As a matter of fact, people who consider themselves veteran Republicans or Republicans. Now, this is showing that we have a process here that isn't really what was described by the Trump fans as a small group of people backed by George Soros, a very small number, insignificant, paid to go and protest. This is something much bigger than what Donald Trump and his allies and supporters are talking about. So here are some of the stats. Some of these demonstrations had over 100,000 people, to say the least, in some of them. Again, 2,700 locations or events took place. We're talking about areas in wide range background metros and suburban areas and cities all across the United States. So we can't say that a group of people here or a group of people there. Very large protests indeed. Why are they protesting, and what were they calling for? Well, some of the motivations behind these protests included the deployment of authoritarian tactics by Donald Trump internally inside of the United States, such as the deployment of the National Guard in some of the Democratic-run cities, aggressive immigration enforcement, crackdown on liberal groups. In many of these protests, we also saw Palestinian flags and criticism for the continued Israeli lobbying and influence on the United States and the decision-making policies. Hence why some of the people who participated in these protests were Republicans or people who are considered to be on the right wing, conservatives, people who voted for Donald Trump in hope that Donald Trump would actually stop the madness, stop what's happening in the United States and what they do to support an entity that is committing a genocide against the Palestinian people. So it's not just Democrats, it's not just the radical left, as Donald Trump liked to portray them. We're talking about a very diverse group of people protesting all across of the United States. Why were they protesting? Well, of course, the authoritarian measures of Donald Trump, all of the things that we mentioned before, and they also, and one main thing here, are resisting this approach of Donald Trump and his obsession with being a king. That's why they said no king's protest. Donald Trump, on the other hand, he said later on, I'm not a king, actually. And we'll get to the response of Donald Trump, the very dangerous and symbolic response of Donald Trump. We're talking about, in general, so far, unprecedented protests on several levels, turnout and reasons behind it. We're talking about nationwide reach, 2,700 events, more than 50 or in 50 states, the nature of the participation, diverse ages, geographies, and backgrounds. Many of them were talking about how American it is really to protest peacefully against the authoritarian approach. But they weren't just protesting against one thing. That's a very important note. It's not like Donald Trump came up with one policy and everyone said, oh yeah, we need to protest against this policy. A wide array of things which make these protests again different in previous protests that took place in the United States. Donald Trump had a response, and Donald Trump's response wasn't really, peaceful or anything. He had a couple of statements saying that, yeah, well, these people, they actually are a small number of people. They are backed by George Soros. They're paid to do that. It's not really significant. But the most symbolic thing that Donald Trump posted was this video over here. Let's have a look. The video speaks for itself, really. The American president on a fighter jet that says King Trump wearing a crown. The fighter jet has bombs, but he decides to land poop on the protesters everywhere. Imagine for 1 second that it was the Chinese president who did that or the Russian president who did that. They published a video like this. Imagine 7 million Russians or Chinese protesting against the government. Imagine 7 million Iranians protesting against the government, and the Iranian supreme leader publishes this video. Imagine any other country that the United States does not like or is very hostile to conduct something like this. This man is supposedly the leader of the free world. He is the president of the United States of America, the biggest Western country that is supposedly representing Western values and democracy and freedom of speech and the right of people to protest and people's opinions and taking into consideration what people think and what people do. But I personally think that this message has more than what some people are interpreting, at least in my opinion. That's my observation. Firstly, because Donald Trump deployed the National Guard in multiple states in the United States, meaning that he is willing to use his power as the president to execute or enforce hostile measures against Americans in the United States purely because of conflicting ideas or approaches of certain governors in the United States. Now he is publishing a video of himself landing poop on American people. Okay, let's not forget that some of the people on the Trump side were saying that these protests in the United States are protests to support Hamas. We were talking about some of the protesters going there against the infiltration of the Israeli lobby and showing discontent with how Donald Trump is influenced and moved by and operating on behalf of the Zionist and Israeli lobby in the United States. And now they are blaming 7 million Americans from 50 states in 2,700 events coming from a wide range of the people, although certain very limited polls said that over 94% of them were white Americans, just to note that. Of course, it would have been different because you can't really have conclusive statistics in anything to do with 7 million people protesting in so many places, unless there were bodies that were there to confirm everything. But if Donald Trump is blaming these people for operating or supporting, for example, Hamas, all of a sudden, as if anyone was talking about anything to do with Hamas. They were talking about everything to do with Donald Trump's policies in the United States. What is he trying to do here? And what is he trying to do with this video that you're seeing over here to justify taking action against American people? And that's something that we've been talking about ever since the beginning of the genocide in Palestine, when some people were justifying the genocide, and how this justification does not really restrict itself to the Palestinian people, but this justification extends it to other places too. And it would be only a matter of time up until countries and world leaders who support this will decide to take action against their own people. Now, we're not talking about imminent, by the way, action or anything as such, because these protests that took place in the United States, they took place on Saturday. It's not like these protests at the same level and with the same intensity are happening every single day. That isn't really the case, but there is a prospect that these protests might escalate at one point and become a daily occurrence in the United States. And if we assume that these protests that took place in that size or a similar size really start to take place on a day-to-day basis and start to apply real and genuine pressure on the country, and Donald Trump starts to say, oh no, it's a shutdown, for example, and he starts to use any of old excuses to shut them down and have a massive crackdown, what is to prevent us from believing that Donald Trump will actually start to take enforcement action that is very violent and hostile? There were already scenes, by the way, of violent enforcement coming from the federal government against these totally peaceful protests in the United States, all across the country. There is nothing that can prevent Donald Trump from actually going ahead and applying this pressure on these people. The United States has been increasingly getting more and more authoritarian, primarily after the 9/11 false flag and the acts in the United States that were restricting the people. The Patriot Act, for example, that started to restrict people and the right to free speech, constantly applying more pressure and more restrictions on people to protest, then blaming the people who are protesting for working for a third party, or saying that these people are somehow funded or supporting a banned organization abroad. Baseless, of course, accusations. However, what we're saying here is primarily to highlight the fact that Donald Trump eventually might just do that. We're talking about the same man who supported and facilitated a genocide against innocent civilians and women and children, and actually bragged about how well Benjamin Netanyahu used these lethal American weapons against the Palestinian people. What prevents us, or what would stop us from believing that the same man who justified the use of these lethal weapons against innocent people in Palestine wouldn't justify the use of the same lethal weapons, or even worse, against the American people?